Welcome to the Personal Pension Radio Podcast, where you get unconventional insights into wealth building and retirement that actually work. Discover data-driven strategies and learn from a wealth of experience so that you can take your retirement to the next level. Now, here's your host. He was once bitten by a harbor seal, the income engineer, Kraig Strom.
Okay, we are back on Personal Pension Radio, joined on the phone with Matthew Wesley. Hello, Matthew.
Hello, Craig. How are you?
We're doing good. We're doing good. We are broadcasting today from a very special location. We are broadcasting still from Mr. Foley's van today, parked on the lawn at Chateau Ste. Michelle Vineyards in Woodinville, Washington. I had to pronounce it correctly, right? Woodinville?
You did.
Yeah, so the winery's not really happy with us being parked on the lawn, but once you get Mr. Foley's van parked somewhere, it's kind of hard to get it started again, so we'll just go ahead and broadcast from here until they tow us away. How's that sound?
Sounds good to me.
So those of you who are new to Personal Pension Radio, this show is all about optimizing retirement income. Optimizing retirement income means preserving your legacy in the form of lifestyle so that you can actually enjoy your family and enjoy your retirement and actually have a lifestyle to look forward to. The real secret to retirement income planning in some respects is the fact that a product is not the answer. Whether that product is a mutual fund, life insurance, real estate, annuities, whatever it might be that is being pitched, the product itself is not the answer. Unless you actually have an integrated approach, you don't actually have a plan for maximum income and maximizing that enjoyment. And the reason I've invited Matthew on the phone with us today is that one of the big things that I find that holds back, and I'm doing air quotes for you, average families from creating real, lasting, and growing financial legacies is the average thinking that has been passed down through generations and that is perpetuated by financial institutions. And I'm sure you've seen that many times, Matt, that the average folks, even folks with the large sums of money, still think very average when it comes to legacies and the way they look at their finances, right?
Absolutely. No question about it.
Yeah, so that's what we're actually going to talk about today. It goes right along with the theme of this podcast that in order to maximize your lifestyle, your legacy, and everything, you actually have to have the right frame of mind to be open to receiving the knowledge and the information that's going to help you overcome that average thinking. So before we get started too deep into this, a short disclaimer. I personally am not an attorney. I'm not a CPA. I am a certified financial planner professional. But the most important thing to remember is when you're out there reading a financial magazine or you're listening to a financial entertainer, and for the record, a financial entertainer is someone who might have a radio show, a TV show, an article in a magazine, and they have no licensing to go with the fact that they're offering financial advice. They're out there offering financial advice with no regulatory oversight, no licensing, nobody checking their advice. I encourage you not to act on advice that you hear from financial entertainers, radio hosts, TV hosts, or even on this podcast. Before you act on something, meet with a qualified financial advisor. Qualified financial advisor before you actually act on the advice. So there's my short disclaimer. Let me jump into actually getting to know Matt. Tell me, Matt, the Wesley Group, what's it all about?
Sure. Well, let me give you a little bit about my background, and then we can dive into the work that we do. I'm a former estate planning attorney, and did that for many, many years. Before that, I actually was a campus minister. I hold a Master's of Divinity as well as a JD. The estate planning I did actually led me to a realization that in many ways the estate planning process that we use in the United States is broken. It puts two people behind closed doors who make plans for other people who aren't involved in the process, and it can end up being fraught with anxiety. The estate planning process is often rooted in the anxieties of the people who are creating their estate plans.
Yeah.
It can also have built-in assumptions, and it can have other problems. And so what I ended up doing was beginning to bring the children into the estate planning process. Warren Buffett has said recently, over the last couple of years, that estate planning is no longer an individual responsibility, it's a family responsibility. And I think that he's hit the nail on the head, as he often does. And so I began to bring families into the process, and in the course of that, I realized that there was a lot more going on with families around the transfer of wealth than just simply the estate planning piece of it. There's what I've come to see as a chasm between the planning that occurs and the execution that occurs. Oftentimes people do a marvelous job of planning, but when it comes time to execute the plan, the family dynamics will undo that plan. And so one way this has been put in the marketplace is that people can do a wonderful job of preparing the money for the family, but don't necessarily do a very good job of preparing the family for the money.
No, that
and
is
so
so
the
true.
Wesley Group. So the Wesley Group is really all about crossing that chasm between planning and execution, and that chasm is bridged with preparation. So we catalyze changes in families. We come in and work with wealthy families that are transferring businesses or transferring substantial amounts of wealth, and we help them change. We help them shift, and we do it through a series of interventions that create rapid but lasting change.
And I think that's this very important piece here, because we are just blessed on this show to have an audience really from all around the country, all around the world. We've had just great fun talking to folks who are from, I would say, almost every socioeconomic class that might be out there that has an iPhone, has listened to this show at one place in the world or another. The piece that I want everybody to catch here, though, is that Matt is talking about wealthy families. And if you're sitting there riding your bike, walking, listening to this podcast, and you're thinking, oh, this show doesn't pertain to me, I'm not a wealthy person. Stop doing that. That is exactly what we're trying to change in this conversation, is that what Warren Buffett does, or what Bill Gates does, or what Elon Musk does as these billionaires we see on TV, they do things as far as the way they think about money and the way that they're talking about money with family and generations. They just do it differently. They have different conversations. There's no reason that you as an average person, me as an average person, can't have that same type of conversation, and that's what we're trying to encourage, right?
That's absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Tell me, if you would, tell me the family that backs up your all of your work and your home life. I mean, you've got family around you, right? Because
sure, I do. I have a wonderful wife. We've been married since 1977, and she's a psychologist and works with in a private practice here in Washington, and has been doing that for a very long time. And then we have two children. Our son Ian is 32 and married. He lives about an hour and a half south of us, and then our daughter is finishing up college, and she is about an hour north of us. And family's doing well. It's gratifying to see your kids grow into responsible and capable adults, and obviously bumps along the way, but good things have come from the process. So Marcia and I are both very pleased by that.
That's outstanding. I have one in college who's going through a few bumps right now, just medically. She's experiencing her first couple of medical crises when she's not at home, where my wife can drive her to the doctor. She's having to actually,
Wow.
she's handling things on her own. Like, she's going to be okay. There's no huge crisis, but being taken to the hospital by EMTs for the first time when you're not at home, that's a big deal. So she's okay.
Wow. Yeah.
Now,
and a few nervous moments for the parents in the process.
Oh my gosh, yes. Now tell me, I like to ask for a favorite motivational quote. You actually shared one that I had not heard before. Do you have that in front of you?
I don't. Would you remind me?
Yeah, let me do it here. This is I
think it was Otto Scharmer's quote about shaping awareness.
It is. The quote is, "The way you shape your attention determines outcome." And that's Otto Scharmer. Could you tell us kind of why you picked that one and what that means to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Otto Scharmer is an interesting cat. He teaches out of MIT's Sloan School of Management, but he's developed a process for understanding how leaders can shape an emergent future, and the recognition that there are clues all around us, everywhere we look, about what could happen and how it could happen, and how you shape your attention, how you pay attention to what it is that is arising around you, has everything to do with what the future outcomes will be. And this isn't magical thinking. It's not about kind of imagining a future and somehow it's going to magically appear. It's about recognizing that there are certain things that exist already, and that some of those, if you give energy to and you pay attention to it, certain things will happen. And if you don't give attention to other things will happen. And so it's all about how you shape your attention, what you let in, how you let it in, how you host the reality that is your life, and all of that will shape what occurs next, in the next moment, in the next hour, the next year, so on and so forth.
That actually goes to something that I had actually read on your website. And by the way, for those of you who are new to the podcast, all of this information is going to be transcribed. It'll be in the show notes, all the links that we mentioned. So don't try and write anything down while you're riding your bike or driving your car. But on your website, this actually goes back to, because something you alluded to in there is, you say this isn't touchy-feely or woo-woo, right? It's actually real stuff that real people can apply in their lives. You don't have to be at the top of a mountain somewhere, speaking to a bearded man to ask a question, right?
Right, exactly. Well, and it is interesting. I mean, I think, if you go back to the 1970s and all the, the hot tubs and the new age crystal gazing and all the rest of it, there was a lot of nonsense that was associated with that, but there were also some pretty deep insights that were generated and that are now cascading through high performance teams, football teams, SEAL teams, surgical teams, as well as the harder edges of corporate consulting and other places. And if you look at those things, they're technologies of human performance and human awareness. And I think there's a growing recognition that it's not all about action, that there is a way in which the internal landscape determines what happens on the outside.
Absolutely.
And so those technologies are not some sort of new age gobbledygook. They're extraordinarily practical ways of making your own life better, more effective as a human being, and finding deeper inner peace and equanimity in your life as well.
Now, I have to absolutely agree that I know that personally when I take the time, and it's very hard for me personally, those who know me, I am ADHD boy. I'm up early, go all day, and it's hard to focus. But when I do take the time to, even for that very small moment, to meditate in a moment or to to stop and pause and just focus. There's truly powerful opportunities there when you apply your mind to that particular moment. It is really interesting that we don't do that enough, and that kind of leads me to my one of my questions is that what keeps families from being successful in this generational transitions. And what we mean, by the way, what I mean is generational transition is that when we look at truly wealthy, millionaire, billionaire families of the ages, right? I read a great book years ago called Dynasties, and it was a history of some of the wealthiest families over the last several hundred years. And there's some very unique characteristics in those families that led to generational wealth. And today, whether they be folks be average, millionaires, billionaires, whatever it might be, what is it that keeps these families today from that successful generational transition?
What keeps them from it, or what fosters it? And what keeps them from it is largely what I would call unmanaged anxieties. What you see is families are systems of anxiety. And let me talk about something that may be of real relevance to a lot of your listeners. One of the flashpoints for anxiety is family wealth. But your family may not be extraordinarily wealthy, and this still applies. And let me give you a case in which it applies. When you have aging parents, oftentimes the aging of the parents and the rising of the next generation to take their place provokes all sorts of anxiety responses. Everybody has a different view of what should happen and how it should happen, and everybody is concerned about it. There's a great deal of emotional energy being put into that system. And as a result, people have a great deal of anxiety about what the future will hold. And that anxiety leads to typical biological responses. One is to fight. The other is to flee. The third typical response is to flock, which is where you seek emotional support, and you might get together with your brother or sister and talk about your other family members and talk about what awful or difficult people they are. That's blocking. You might freeze in the face of it and just get paralyzed and stuck in these anxiety responses. And then the final response, which is one that we see all the time, is to try and fix it. You just run in and you take action, trying to quell the chaos, and sometimes it's effective and sometimes it isn't. And so those anxiety responses become dominant, and if they're not managed, if they're not led, and if they're not grounded, then those anxiety responses can just tear families apart. And you see it oftentimes with aging parents. You see it with the transitions of wealth and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I see that personally, Matt. I've seen it many, many times in 18 years of doing this in the financial services world. It is amazing what you just said. Just brought up so many memories of sitting in a room where might have 2 or 3 children in the room, and all 3 of them have a different response to speaking of mom or dad aging, someday dying, passing on their estate. Very different responses oftentimes from each of the 3 or 4 or 2, whatever it is in the room. It's amazing.
Right. Exactly. Well, and if you add estate planning to the mix, and if people are leaving a little bit more money to their heirs than just simply leaving outright gifts to them in equal shares, what you see is that the anxiety of the parents goes through the roof. One of the worst, the most Orwellian named instruments in the legal framework is a trust, because the entire thing is premised on mistrust, right? It's premised on anxiety. It's based on the belief that someone can't manage their own affairs and therefore needs needs someone else to oversee the money, and it's almost always rooted in the parent's anxiety, sometimes well-founded, obviously. Oftentimes kids aren't able to handle that kind of money. But the dynamics that grow out of a structure that's based purely on anxiety and not based on conversation and based on really solid preparation is going to fall apart. It's going to be a disaster in the lives of children. One of the shocking statistics that comes out of the research that's been done is that 80% of trust beneficiaries view their trust more as a burden than a blessing. And most beneficiaries believe the trust was set up for tax purposes, not out of a sense of love for them or concern for them. And so, they're dysfunctional structures from the very beginning, and they foster a kind of dependency or a resentment or difficult relationships between beneficiary and trustee. Whereas if they were co-designed with people who were going to be the beneficiaries, and there was clear purpose behind them, and people understood what those purposes were, it would be an entirely different story.
Right. I've seen that personally, and I just want to go back to something you just said, co-designed. Co-designed being involve your children in the conversation, involve your children in the discussion around the idea that maybe you just have a very basic estate. You want to pass on a home that is paid off and perhaps some annuities or life insurance or an IRA. You want to pass those things through to your family. Well, writing a trust and following the old mantra that we don't speak of politics or finances, and that's going to lead to perhaps, folks fighting at the end when they have a trust that has to be settled, right? I actually have a thing that I've said for years that if you put lots and lots of restrictions and lots of various different ups and downs inside a trust document or a will that says, I want X amount to go to here and X amount to go there, and I want these three people to run the, everything when I'm gone. Basically, what I tell folks is, in that kind of a situation, just make your least favorite child your trustee or your executor, right? Right? Just make your least favorite child the trustee of that particular trust, because it's probably going to turn out to be a real pain in the butt if they have to do some restrictive management of some estate distribution. But when you do it together, it's easy, right? When everybody's involved,
yeah.
it's easy.
Yeah. Well, and you pointed out in your somewhat facetious advice here, which isn't. Yeah, I mean, it is a chore. It is a burden to name somebody, say, as executor. One of the things that I would find all the time, that was one of the assumptions that was being made in the estate planning process. Someone would say, my oldest child is the most responsible, and therefore they ought to be executor. And one of the things that I would, when I was a younger attorney, I'd just say, okay, let's put their name in. And as I began to tumble to some of this stuff, I said to them, go check with your kids. Have them have a conversation about this. You're not going to be there. What do you care about who actually administers this thing, right? And they'd come back and they were shocked. And it could be over simple things. It could be things like, I was going to name my oldest daughter to do this, and she said to me, Dad, I'm raising 3 kids. I've got a busy life. I don't have time to learn how to do this. And as much as I love my siblings and I want to see this done right, it's going to pit me against my younger sibling who has always had problems with me for this reason or that reason, and it's just a terrible idea to name me as the executor for all sorts of different reasons. Right. And all of a sudden, with a simple conversation between the siblings and them coming to an agreement, you have sidestepped potential profound anguish in the family, torn relationships that could last for the rest of your children's lifetimes by naming the wrong person as the executor of your will. And plenty of times what I would find is that the kids would say, look, don't name any of us. Name, Uncle Bob, because we all like and respect Uncle Bob, and we think he's a great guy, and he would do a wonderful job of this, and he's got the time to do it. And your kids are often smarter than you give them credit for, and so to allow them to have some control and some say in over how all of this is going to work itself out is a gift to them. It's a huge gift.
No, for sure. I appreciate that. Absolutely. That right there, folks, as you're out there thinking about it. Now, people have heard me say this one-on-one in meetings where I have meetings with clients and prospective clients, and I've said it on various different platforms that for me personally, the reason that a husband and wife, for example, go out and do a will or get a living trust is for their love of their children. So if that's the case, get them involved in the process so that it really is something that can be an act of love rather than something that causes contention. Because if that's the case, I mean, if you really don't like them, the other thing that I'll tell folks is that you handwrite 2 separate wills and you hide it in 2 different places in the house and you name 3 different people as the executor in each of them, right? You make it real. If you really don't love them, do it that way. But if you really love them, get them involved in the conversation. Get them involved. So much better. Yeah. Now, when we think about this generational transition, that unmanaged anxiety is a big piece of it. Is there anything else in there from your perspective and having done this for so long that really hampers, that really holds back this generational transition to the next step? Is there anything that really holds it back that you can put your finger on for us?
Well, let me flip that a little bit, and let's move to the positive side, if that's okay. Because
absolutely.
I think that'll be instructive. So one of the things that you see in wealthy families, and what arises in wealthy families, is that there's a reason for them to stick together. They believe that they're better off together than they are going their own separate ways, and there could be a lot of things that are tying that together. For example, the existence of a business that's moving from one generation to the next, or philanthropic endeavors that they have together, or whatever it might be. But one of the things that the research shows, and it shows it very clearly, is that there are 2 great things that happen in wealthy families. The first great thing is the creation of the wealth, and that's the thing that everybody's focused on. People are oftentimes focused on the wealth creator, and that's particularly true in the advisory community. There's a huge deference to the person who created the wealth, and partly because they're paying the bills, partly because they're seen as heroes in our society, and so there's a little bit of hero worship going on. Partly because they're strong, powerful people who've managed to take nothing and create something really profound out of that. It's a Promethean act. It's a powerful thing. The thing that goes unnoticed oftentimes is that these great families in the second or third generation have someone arise who is a family leader who recognizes that there is a great value in holding the family together, and they have the wisdom and the strength of will and the political skill and the compassion and the equanimity to be able to forge a family alliance at either the sibling level in G2 or the cousin level in G3, and they managed to pull that and together and make it a cohesive whole, where they're making collective decisions together, where they're figuring out how to get through family squabbles together, and so on and so forth. That person has been called in the literature the family champion. And what I've noticed is that in succession planning, almost all of the attention in the professional world is around what I would call the concerns of the patriarch: taxes, money, control, all of the things that are at the heart of the way that moves. but the success is really determined not on the patriarchal side of things, although that's important, and I wouldn't want to minimize the need for good legal counsel and good financial advice and solid support on that side of it. But the real action is on the matriarchal side. What I saw over and over again in the estate planning world was that when Dad died, people would grieve and miss him, and it was a sad day, but not much changed in the family. But when Mom died, the spaghetti would hit the fan, and
for sure.
That's when all of the sibling rivalries and jealousies and miscommunication and lack of trust would just pop out. And the reason for that was that the force of the matriarch, the ability that she had to keep her kids in line, was no longer there. And so the question is who is going to fulfill the role that Mom played in the family? And that's the question of matriarchal succession. Who is going to be the person who's going to keep this family together through the tumult of making business decisions together, of having to deal with questions of equity and fairness, and all the rest of it. And that role is a profound and powerful role. And I would imagine that in every family that you read about in that Dynasty book that succeeded, it was because of a commitment to remain together, and because there were family leaders who arose, who paid attention to those pieces that I'm talking about when I'm talking about the succession of the matriarch.
No doubt. And I agree with you there, and I've seen that personally. And it doesn't, if I'm getting this right, that when you have a transition that someone has been, I guess, either identified directly or that steps up into that family champion position, it doesn't necessarily have to be male or female, but kind of fills in that matriarchal role.
Right, exactly. No, it can be men as well as women. It's just somebody who says it's important for us to stick together, and who has the will and the capabilities and skills to be able to make that happen. Often it is a woman, but oftentimes it's a man, and it really it just depends on the family and what's going on within the family. And sometimes it's a group of people. There are 2 or 3 people who say, we really need to keep this together. Sometimes it's all the siblings, but it's really a question of who's going to ensure that this family sticks together, come hell or high water. That allows families to succeed through these generational transitions.
Now that's a great way to put that. And now here's the big question, I guess, as we talk about this: how do you shift that family culture? Because this is not. Yep. This is not pre-programmed in families, for example, that let's say that we have a baby boomer generation that Mom and Dad have had more success than any previous generation in their family's history, perhaps built a business, perhaps accumulated a substantial amount of wealth in real estate or something like that. And yet they've never had this cultural component built into their family dynamic. How do you shift that family culture?
Sure, that's a terrific question. So first of all, every family has a culture. Every group of people has a culture, and the way that I describe culture is very amorphous. People talk about it in terms of values or norms or the ways they operate together as a family, their belief system, and you can touch all sorts of different pieces of culture, and it feels very squishy. It's hard to get your arms around what family culture is. So the way that I describe it is actually by a metaphor. What I say to people is that your family culture is the software by which your family operates. Oh. It's the way in which everything that happens, that you organize, everything that you do out there in the world is being run by this family, this software of the individuals. And all you have to do to recognize that to take a look at what's going to happen in the holiday season as your family gathers together. And you know exactly what's going to happen, and you know how it's going to happen. It's almost as though it's a subroutine in a software program. People are going to cut out the same storage. You're going to do the same thing. And so it's that software. That's a manifestation of your family culture. It's how you do a holiday. So the question is, how do you change it and how do you shift it? And there are, I think, a number of consulting pieces that people use that I don't think are particularly effective. So, for example, one of the things that you often see is people coming in and creating mission statements, or they'll try to identify family values, and they'll create a mission statement or a value statement. Those are interventions that work to greater or lesser degrees in the corporate world, but families are not corporate. They're tribal. They operate on a different system. And so having a mission statement as a family is kind of look at that and you go, well, that's kind of silly because it's not that kind of organization. So the question is, what allows families to stick together? And the first thing that I would say is that they have an explicit set of conversations about what they believe about their relationship as a family. What are our obligations to one another? What do we owe to one another? And what can we expect from the family in terms of support and of care and love from the family as a whole? What should be the minimal amount of work that we believe is necessary to keep this family together for ourselves? And how do we enjoy one another? How do we really engage with one another? So to come to some basic agreements about what I would call the moral fabric of the family. What is it that keeps us in relationship with one another? And when I say moral fabric, I'm not talking about rules or restrictions. I'm talking about how do we maintain a good, solid, caring relationship with each other? How do we remain in relationship? And so that's the first order of business, is to really come to clarity around what that might be. And then beyond that, there's a question of what do we want to be as a family? And one way to talk about that is as a vision statement. What's our vision for our family? But to me, that's kind of bloodless, and it doesn't really touch the emotions. It's an exercise in rational planning. What you really want to do is paint a picture of the future. And so one of the things that I use is scenario planning, where we just look at different possible outcomes. One way to get at this is to ask the family, if you continue to do what you have been doing, where will you be in 10 or 15 years? And oftentimes they look at that and they're not happy with it. And then you ask the question of, where would you like to be in 10 years? What would that look like? What would it feel like? What would it be like to be at a family reunion? Put yourself in it. So it becomes a much more emotional picture of the future. It has color, it has texture, and all the rest of it. And when the family begins to dream into 4 or 5 different possible futures, it can begin to say, oh, this is the one that we most like. This is the one that we want to move towards. And so rather than trying to create alignment around a mission statement, what you do is you create an attunement. Everybody says, this is where we want to go. Everybody gets to act independently because nobody's the boss of anybody else in the family. And so how do you attune yourself to one another so you're all kind of moving in the same general direction? And so it creates a resilient, agile approach. And then I'll just name one other thing that I oftentimes do when I'm seeing dysfunction in a family, or what might pass for dysfunction from the outside. Most families are trying to do the best they can, and dysfunction pathologizes what the family has actually come to, which is a fairly adaptive way to get along with each other, no matter how crazy making it may seem from the outside.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. You get along one way or another.
Exactly. And so, but most families would say, this is a little dramatic for me, and I'd rather have a little less drama and a little more effectiveness. And so one of the things that you can do is you can bring in a notion of games and how games are being played within the family. Sometimes I'll call it games, sometimes I won't. Sometimes people, when they hear the word games, think it means that it's trivialized when it's not. But, for example, let's say you have a family business, and there's a lot of controversy around the family business for whatever reason. What you can do is you can say, okay, the family is playing the game of family business. And let's call this game family business. And then the question is, how are you playing that game? What are the roles in the game? Who's winning? Who's losing? How do you determine when a round is over? Who are the other players in the game besides the family? There can be all sorts of different ways that you explore that metaphor. And what it does is it objectifies what's going on. Nobody's at fault for this game. It's a whole system that's doing this. It's not any one individual doing anything to anybody else. It's just simply the way they've organized that particular game. And oftentimes the family can have a very objective discussion about what's going on and how they're playing the game. And then you can have a conversation about, well, do you want to play that game? Is that a game you really want to continue to play? Or if you do want to play it, how do you want to change the game? How do you want to up the game? Or do you want to play a different game? Do you want to really shift and do things radically differently? And so all of a sudden what it does is it creates a degree of optionality, and people can come to new agreements around roles and responsibilities and rewards and all sorts of other things that end up working out of this new game that they're playing together.
And I have to ask, just for your experience in this, that when you use that and you come at it from the game perspective, do you find that people are more readily outgoing and they're less fearful of repercussion or retaliation from other family members because we're just talking about the game, right?
Yeah, well, it objectifies it, and it washes a little bit of the anxiety out of it because you can kind of distance yourself from it. And the other thing it does is if you start looking at it as a game, it becomes very difficult to say it's all Bob's fault, right? Because you're playing the game too, and you have a role in the game, and there are certain things that you're doing that are creating the game the way it is. And so you have to take a little bit of responsibility for the way the game is being played out. So it tends to reduce blame and judgment, and it tends to reduce anxiety, and it makes visible to the system what for them is an extraordinarily complex, convoluted, and difficult set of facts to wrap their heads around, right? If you're in it, it just feels overwhelming. How do we get out of this thing that we're doing together? We don't even see it, let alone know how to get out of it. Whereas when you reduce it to a game, even though it's more complex than a game, but the game metaphor allows you to see it in a very different way and get above it so that you're looking down on what's happening as opposed to being in the middle of it.
No, I appreciate that. My business coach, Gary Lockwood, is often telling me to get up in the press box in the stadium and look down on the playing field and come at it from a different perspective. Here's the thing.
Exactly.
Yeah, so here's the thing. So I had a recent experience with someone that was introduced to me by a client of mine, and this person came in, and I asked him, so why are you here? Basic question, right? So your friend suggested that you come see me. Why are you here? Because I find that most people will often have something on their mind if they actually took an appointment with a CFP, right? And he said, well,
sure.
To be honest, I am really here just because he said that I should come see you. And he's kind of my boss, so I didn't want to be rude. Well, I paused and I just said, okay, well, is there anything on your mind? And a page and a half full of notes later, right?
Yeah.
Turns out there's a lot of stuff on his mind, but here's the thing. This person described his whole situation, and turns out he is the furthest thing from a close, open quote, close quote, air quotes, average guy. He actually has amassed a very substantial, larger than any time in the history of his family, a substantial amount of wealth. And yet, all the way through the conversation, every question I asked, he sees himself as just some average guy. And every question I asked that might have been financially related, he came back with the standard, pre-programmed average guy answer. And he has this real opportunity that he doesn't understand to create generational wealth as never before in his family, to send wealth into the future, to just change the trajectory of his family name, and he doesn't know it. So my question is to you, how do you engage with families to do this work? How do you engage in that?
That's a really good question. It's going to be different with different people on this.
Oh, no doubt, I'm sure.
But there's an old adage that you've heard. I think probably everybody's heard, which is shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And what that adage contains within it, oftentimes, is a great deal of suffering. And that suffering can come in a lot of different forms. But oftentimes, when people receive money and they're not prepared for it, it can do great damage to them. One of the things that I noticed as an estate planning attorney, and I'll keep this short, but I was working with very wealthy people in the Silicon Valley who it was new tech wealth, and it was first generation wealth, and we were putting trusts together for kids, and often, some of these people had hundreds of millions of dollars, and so it was a lot of money that was going to be going down to these kids, and I would go ahead and do what every estate planning attorney did. I'd set up trusts for them, and as time went on, I began to realize there was more to the game than that, and so I started really working with families around preparing their kids for this wealth. One parent asked me at one point, how much is enough? And for whatever reason, I was feeling rather bold that day, so I said, why wouldn't you want to prepare kids to handle it all? Not necessarily even leave it all to them,
right.
But why wouldn't you want to do that? What would be the reason not to do that? And so that caused us to embark with he and his wife and I embark on a really thoughtful plan on how to prepare the kids to handle all of it, which was really good. Fast forward, this practice that I had grew like crazy, and I ended up becoming a partner in a law firm that was dealing with multi-generational wealth. And what I saw was the wreckage that had been created 2 or 3 generations before, where this money had been put in trust. And what you saw were kids who had partied in their 20s and 30s, and by their 40s and 50s, it was just pathetic. Or you saw these kids who had never been prepared and didn't want to have anything to do with the wealth. They were living very modest lives, driving used Hondas because they couldn't wrap their heads around the fact that they were wealthy and didn't want to be wealthy, did not want that at all. And they had been ill prepared for it. And then, there were a few, maybe 20%, who were doing really well, who were going out and starting businesses, who were being productive with their lives, who held down jobs and recognized the value of making a contribution to the world just for their own psychological well-being. They didn't need the money, but they recognized that doing something useful was gratifying. And so I began to ask myself, well, what's the difference here? And how does that work out? But you see this shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves thing, and I would say at least 60% of the people that I ran into were either in that maybe closer to 80% were either in that living off the fat of the land and partying in their 20s and 30s crowd, or in that we want to just live under the radar group, and we don't want to have anything to do with the well. And so both of those things are painful to watch, the lost potential of lives that are just decimated by this wealth. So there's the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves thing. The interesting thing is that 2 generations ago, Grandma and Grandpa would be dead before the money got to the grandchildren.
Right.
Now with the increased longevity, that's no longer true. And the people that are who are wealthy and who are passing their wealth on to their children and doing advanced tax planning and not just leaving it in their wills, because you can't save on estate taxes, so people push money out pretty early. They're living long enough to see the entire parable play out in their lifetime. They're seeing their grandchildren ruined by the money that they created.
Wow. See, that's an interesting perspective of the change in mortality. Actually,
exactly.
That's a very interesting perspective, and yet opens the door to the opportunity for the grandchildren to actually receive some wealth and knowledge at the same time from Grandma and Grandpa.
Yeah. Well, but the interesting thing is that by the time you're in your 80s and 90s, it's too late.
Yeah.
Right? You can't do anything about it. You're losing your health. You're losing, you no longer have the influence that you had with your grandchildren. Your kids are in their 60s, right? Or 50s or 60s. Your grandchildren are in their 20s or 30s. It's too late. So the time to begin this work is when parents are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. That's the time to begin it. And if you don't, you could spend the last 10 years of your life watching the money ruin the lives of the people you most care about.
That is such an interesting perspective that I hadn't considered in the big change in people living longer. I mean, we talk about it here on Personal Pension Radio, that one of the most important reasons for income and legacy planning is because we are living longer. The reality also being that you're living long enough nowadays to see, when you did that living trust or that will in the lawyer's office without the children around and you never told them about it, and yet now here you are perhaps watching you're watching the outcome of that good-natured planning that you did so long ago that wasn't tied to something that actually really meant something to them. So that's a really, I guess that's an absolutely good way to, as we wrap up today, when I ask for tips and precautions, I guess that ties right into it. It sounds like the conversation needs to start sooner than you think. I guess that's probably a good way to go. Sooner the better.
Yep, exactly. And if I may, one of the interesting things that I see, particularly with my generation, I'm a baby boomer, so one of the things I see with the baby boomers is that, we're forever young, and we're always trying to continue to do things in the world. And what I've seen is that, and I see this over and over again in clients, is that in their 50s they're still building empire. They've arrived by every measure of success. They've arrived, but they're still building empire, and they're still focused on what they want to do in the world, and they tend to ignore what needs to happen in their home life because they're engaged in this outward world. And for the patriarchs and matriarchs, it's really about the shift from becoming the player on the field, the quarterback, as it were, to moving into a coaching role and bringing on the rising generations and helping the rising generations become successful in their own right and developing the right skill sets, the right competencies, and the right capabilities, as well as connections among each other that allow them to succeed. So helping helping clients shift into that coaching role is critical.
I think that is that's an outstanding point. I actually now, just personally with clients and friends and people that I know, that just rings so true for any number of people that I know personally, and I'm sure out there in our audience as well. So, Matt, let me ask you this. As we come down to these interviews like this that I get, I just love this conversation because it is so perfect for our audience and the message. How do people actually get in touch with you? And, what would maybe be a first step there?
Sure. It's not difficult. You can call me up on the phone or visit my website. My email address is Matt, M-A-T-T, @thewesleygroup.com. My phone number is 425-647-6066. And I'm always happy to chat on the phone. I don't do sales. I don't believe in it. What I do is just sit down and have a conversation, and if it's valuable, we'll have another conversation. And if that's valuable, then we'll probably end up in some sort of a contractual relationship moving forward. And so it's all about, creating value, being useful in the process. And, sometimes I find I talk with somebody on the phone for an hour or two, and there's no charge, and they feel better and they have a better sense of what to do. And sometimes there's reason for me to come in and really do work with their family. And at that point, it'll become clear to both of us that I'm the right fit and that I have something useful to offer. So it's not about selling anything. It's about finding value in places of overlapping concern and overlapping value.
That's excellent. And for those listening, I'm going to have in the show notes some links that I think would be very important there on Matt's website. You've got a great some examples of case studies, that folks can kind of look through and kind of get a feel for whether you fit in that kind of a piece. If not, you can have the conversation either way. And also, some of the ways that you can actually engage with Matt and his offerings and approaches, there's some great information there as well. So I'm going to have links to this and all of the contact information in the show notes. Matt, really appreciate you being here. This was a great interview. Everybody listening, make sure you check out the show notes and check out Matt's website, and definitely don't sell yourself short. If you find yourself ever saying anything like, "Oh, that doesn't work for me because I'm not rich like so-and-so," stop, back the truck up. That is wrong. Don't think that way. That's number one. Don't think that way. There's no reason to think that way. And hopefully you've gotten that idea and that impression here in the interview. Matt, thank you so much again for joining us. And, I guess I'll talk to you again soon, I'm sure. Look for the next episode on Personal Pension Radio. We do our best to have these episodes out every Monday at 7 a.m. Pacific, and we look forward to hearing from you. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Kraig. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Personal Pension Radio Podcast. If you missed anything during the show, that's okay. We took the notes for you. Check the show notes for links, offers, and a full transcript. And don't forget to head over to personalpensionradio.com and download your free retirement income report. While you're there, we'd appreciate some iTunes love. Please leave us a fantastic rating on iTunes by going to personalpensionradio.com/iTunes. Thanks again for listening.